500,000 unemployed in the public sector in the next 2 or 3 years. That's not the end of it, because the subcontractors to the state sector, which are in private hands, are also going to be affected, and you probably lose about another 1 million jobs there. So Cameron is going to create 1.5 million non-jobs. What a jobs program that is. And, you know, people like Krugman are saying that's the same thing that's going to happen here. If the Republicans get their way, this is what's going to happen. But this actually fits into a little bit of a historical pattern, which I think is important to recognize. The last 2 recessions before this in the United States, in 1990-91 and in 2001, were followed by what are called jobless recoveries. This time around, it seems to be followed by a joblessness-creating recovery. Furthermore, there's something about the joblessness which is really unique now compared to even those before. That is, if the number of people who are long-term unemployed, which in the historic data before this always was no more than 25% of those recorded as being unemployed, but instead of it being 25%, it's now over 50%. So we've got a real serious jobs problem in this country, and it's very much, like I say, located here. And the big question is, what is going to happen about it, and who is going to do it? Now, again, there's a piece of history that you might want to bear in mind. Back in the 1980s, when Reagan came to power, what did Reagan do? Reagan, first off, went into a great kind of arms race with the Soviet Union, with the idea of bringing the Soviet Union down. But as I noted in the New Imperialism, it was also probably going to bring the United States down. And that arms race, of course, was debt-financed. The second thing he did was to cut taxes on the rich. The top tax rate went from around 72% to 30% overnight. And then, of course, what happened during the Reagan years? He ran up the debt, big time. And David Stockman, the budget director, gave away the game. He said, our plan was to run up the debt to such a point that it became so huge that we could then go after all the social programs we didn't like. Now, what did Bush Jr. do? Fought 2 unfunded wars. And at the time when I was writing New Imperialism, I said, well, the outside thing is they're saying 200 billion is going to be lost on this war. And that was, you know, the people who made that calculation were vilified by the White House. They all kind of said, oh, they don't know what they're talking about, this kind of stuff. Well, we're now 2 trillion. Okay. The second thing Bush did was to give a big tax cut to the rich, just like Reagan. And the third thing he did was to give a big gift to Big Pharma with the Medicare prescription drug plan. So the deficit was rising like crazy. And Dick Cheney was very, very fond of saying, Reagan taught us that deficits do not matter. Now, if the Republican Party believes that deficits now matter, how come they didn't believe they mattered back then? Well, because now the debt is at a level where they feel they can go after the social programs. It's the Stockman scenario all over again. And actually, this is the whole history of what neoliberalism has been about, in all sorts of ways. You go back to the 1982 debt crisis in Mexico. The Mexicans had borrowed a lot of money, couldn't pay it back. The investment bankers in New York were going to go bust unless Mexico was rescued. So the IMF and the Treasury rescue Mexico. The New York bankers get paid off. And then what happens is the Mexican people have to pay. So you save the financial system and sock it to the people. And the standard of living of people in Mexico declined by about, I don't know, 25% in 10 years or something of that kind, which was then, of course, followed by the privatization of redistribution through criminal activity in the drug trade and all the rest of it. So this storyline, if you like, which has been going on since the 1970s, is concentrating on something which I think it's very important to generalize about. And the way I would generalize it is this, is that capital always seeks to maximize certain externalities. That is, it tries to take certain of its real costs and shove them elsewhere where they don't have to pay for them. The two big areas where they do this are the environment, and the second area is in the realm of social reproduction. Now, what Marx recounts in Capital is the following kind of idea. The capitalist gives the worker a wage and then lets them figure out how to reproduce themselves. Total non-responsibility for the world of social reproduction. There were movements in the 1960s, 1970s to force capital to internalize some of the costs of social reproduction. And we've had movements, and this goes back to the 30s and the New Deal and all this sort of stuff. We've had movements that have tried to force that. Capital hates that stuff. They want to externalize it. And what much of neoliberalism was about was externalizing the costs of social reproduction as far as they could during the 1980s, 1990s, and so on. So Clinton gave you the Welfare Reform Act, you know. All of those things that were coming down. Now, this politics of externalization of the cost of social reproduction becomes promoted ideologically by kind of saying it's personal responsibility, not the responsibility of the state. It's pushed economically because saying the state cannot afford it. Well, why, if the state can't afford it, can you afford it? And if you can afford it, why can't the state afford it? I mean, you know, it's just kind of, but this is the big line we get preached. We have to actually internalize externalize all of these costs because the state is broke. And how many times have you heard politicians saying, we're broke, we're broke, we're broke, we're broke? But of course, at the same time, that externalization of those costs is adding immensely to the social inequality in the country. So in effect, you have, and I tried to describe this in The Enigma, the development of what I call the Party of Wall Street. And the Party of Wall Street is as embedded in the Democratic Party as it is in the Republican Party. They're the ones who actually control the money that gives you the elections. And there's a very nice kind of little piece in Mother Jones just recently takes this line. It talks about the immense inequality and the fact that if you want to win elections, you almost certainly have to go to the big money, and the big money dominates in both parties. So the Party of Wall Street dominates in Congress. And the Party of Wall Street is going to push and push to externalize these costs. And it's going to push to do it on the environment or prevent internalization of environmental costs, if it possibly can. It's going to push and push to try to externalize the costs of social reproduction. Now, Beverly Silver and Giovanni Arrighi wrote a paper just before he died in which one of the things they were talking about was, in the history of capital, what is the relationship between capital and the realm of social reproduction and environmental? And most of the time it's about externalizing those costs. So here is the politics of the situation. And one of the ways you can do this is, of course, to perpetuate the crisis. I mean, you could resolve the debt tomorrow if you wanted, very easily. You just go tax billionaires. But what does Cuomo say he's going to do? This is a Democratic governor. What does he say? Oh, that super tax on people who have earned more than $1 million a year, I abolish that. That's Cuomo, Democratic governor. You see what I mean about the Party of Wall Street being in control? That was probably the deal he struck with the Party of Wall Street in order to get their backing in his election. So this is what you're beginning to see. And so we're getting the development of a plutocracy around this kind of politics, which is a class politics, which is gaining more and more power with quite astonishing consequences. There's a wonderful survey, I was talking about it a little earlier with people. Somebody asked people in the United States what they thought a fair distribution of income would be. And I know I got 5,000 responses or whatever. I don't know how the sample was done, but anyway. And the fair distribution was considered that the top 20% should receive 30% of the income. When people were asked what they thought the top 20% got, people said they thought they got 60% of the income. Of course, they get 85% of the income. How much further can that go? Particularly when the costs of social reproduction are being externalized and the state is withdrawing. What's going to happen to the bottom 20% with almost no social services, all the rest of it? And that's why I kind of made the argument, well, that's where you're going to get this conflict with those groups in the population that are most affected by the cuts, students, for example, and those groups and those institutional groups in the population, like the public sector unions, who are going to be most savaged. So something like Wisconsin was entirely predictable, except if you had been smart, you would have never, ever have done that in Wisconsin. It's the last place in the world you should do it. I mean, here's a Capitol building in a liberal city with a big university, and, you know, I mean, and Wisconsin has a tradition of radical politics. It's always been divided 50-50 between the left and the right, and the left is pretty left and the right is pretty right, you know. I mean, and it's a great central space in which you can make those protests. I mean, if the Republicans had been smart, they would have done this first in New Jersey or somewhere like that, where it's not as easy to mount and keep those demonstrations going. So that's, if you like, part of the political situation. But there's an incredible contrast between this, in which almost certainly we're going to continue the austerity, and we're going to continue the recessionary low-growth conditions. And if you look at the track record of what's happened as austerity has been visited upon Greece and Ireland, both of them are far worse off than they were. There was absolutely no sign of a turnaround. So it's not going to work in terms of actually generating a recovery at all. But I don't think the Republican Party or the Party of Wall Street necessarily wants a recovery except for themselves. And they've got it. Why should they care about everybody else? So that is, if you like, that situation. But the contrasting story is, of course, what's going on in China. China's not doing this kind of stuff. China's not preaching austerity. Doesn't have to, of course, but what China's done is